All right. So without further ado, without missing a beat here, Sean, thank you so much for being on with us today. And I wanted to first just ask if you could introduce yourself.
Yep, my name is Sean Haraszthy. I'm the Cellar Master at Kenwood Vineyards. I've worked here off and on since 2000. So that's about it for introduction.
That was going to be my question. So how long have you been with Kenwood, and what brought you to Kenwood too?
So I started in 2000 as it was just going to be a summer job. My dad knew the original winemakers and owners, the Lee family, and we came out to Kenwood one day, and he said, if you want to work here, Mike said, there's a job here for you. So it's just a very typical harvest job. We still hire people all the time that have no experience. So that's what it was, and it turned into just a full-blown career. Someone left the business at an opportune time for me and they said, do you want to just slide into his role? And it worked out really well, and kind of still here.
That's great. A lot of stuff does come from good timing, huh?
Yep.
So speaking of that position, can you explain your position right now at Kenwood and what that kind of means?
So for the Cellar Master at Kenwood, it's basically day-to-day cellar operations that I'm in charge of. So we have a crew of about 6 or 7 people, depending on the time of year. Right now, there's a lot of bottling going on. We have a barrel facility that's not on site at Kenwood. It's right down the street, though, in the town of Kenwood. That's a huge thing right now, topping barrels, pumping barrels out for wines that need to get bottled. Again, bottling at Kenwood is pretty much a year-round thing right now for us. So then during harvest, it completely changes. We take on about 20 or 30 people that are just hired through either our HR department reach out or friends that kind of like myself was hired. And that's just a completely different type of season. Bottling does slow down after we get really going, but we do bottle into probably September-ish. But then we get so busy that it's hard to do anything but just take on the grapes that need to come in before the weather changes, and basically fall turns into winter pretty quick here.
Yes, definitely does. Awesome. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. You do have a very distinctive last name, and it kind of brings me back to Sonoma history. As for any of us out there who are learning about Sonoma, you probably are familiar with a man named Augustin Haraszthy. So could you tell us a little bit about, your heritage and your family history?
Yeah, so Augustin Haraszthy is my great-great-great-grandfather. He came to the United States from Hungary in the mid-1800s, kind of like a lot of other people from Europe were at the time, just as America was this new, exciting place. And so he decided to leave Hungary and come here and start a new life. And obviously, there was a big wine region in Hungary at the time. Europe was probably, that was where wine was being made. So he definitely knew a lot about wine, but I don't think originally that's why he came here. He landed in New York like everyone else did, kind of at the Ellis Island way that most folks from Europe got here, and realized that that was probably not a very good place at all to grow grapes, especially the European varietal that hadn't really even been introduced yet. So he kind of blazed his way west, ending up in a few places along the way. One in Wisconsin. He founded a town there called Wallersheim, or the winery is Wallersheim. I think the town may also be called Wallersheim as well. The European varietals just didn't work there. The winters are too harsh. The summers are too hot. It's humid. It totally didn't work. But he did actually have a little bit of success growing a different varietal of grapes called Vinus Lambrusca. That's still grown around the U.S. It's not, if you're a fan of the traditional European wine, it's probably a little different for most people. So he did stick it out there a little bit and then just kept working his way west and finally ended up in San Francisco and realized that the region a little to the north of San Francisco in Sonoma was pretty much perfect and very similar to the regions in Europe that he was familiar with. And started a winery that ended up becoming Buena Vista, which is still a winery today. And, really got the industry off to to a pretty good start. Most likely his best contribution that was bringing the European varietals to the U.S. that had just never been introduced, and that's what he's best known for.
Absolutely, yeah, pretty amazing history there, and pretty cool that it's intertwined, and that seems like it kind of stuck in your family. Great grandmother. I mean, that many times it's still winemaking.
My dad's still in the wine business. My brother is. My dad's dad was. Yeah, we've been doing it for a while.
I love that. That's honestly a great story, and it's hard to see that anymore. So very cool. So what brought him to Sonoma necessarily? Was there something he saw in this region, or I guess maybe from your perspective, do you think Sonoma, brought something out in him that he really wanted to settle in that area with Buena Vista?
Well, he came to San Francisco first, and for people that aren't familiar with the region, Sonoma's only about an hour away now. Then it was probably pretty far away, actually. So he made his way up here, and just if you come here, it does look a little bit like some of the European grape growing regions, like France. It's very green in the winter. It doesn't get crazy hot. The winters are pretty mild. So I think it was probably more dumb luck than him just being here and going, wow, this looks like it would work, and he was right.
Absolutely, it is. And I think that's what I love about it, though, is that people always kind of think of Napa as the first place that comes to mind when it comes to California, but really it was Sonoma that is kind of this heartland of winemaking, kind of the first one of the biggest major regions that there was. And
definitely, especially with the first commercial winery, Buena Vista.
Exactly.
People were still making wine in this area, especially, the Spanish that were up here with the missions and stuff. Were making, sacrilegious wines, or not religious, wine for religious purposes.
Sacramental, yes.
Yeah, sacramental.
So moving on, so we're located in Sonoma. This place is growing as a wine growing region, and there was a group of brothers called the Pagani brothers, and they founded kind of what is now in my background here is the barn, and they kind of started a winery. So can you chat a little bit about who the Pagani brothers were, what they were making, and the influence they've had in the local area?
So the Paganis were an Italian family that I think owned a lot of land in Kenwood. This was a pretty rural area back then. It still is, but even more so then. So they, I think they may have been first generation Italians, and they obviously, coming from another grape growing region, knew that this would work, and it had been working for the past couple of years. I think they started in 1906. So the wine industry was going, and they had a big ranch and planted a lot of grapes. And here's actually the barn here, which is a pretty old picture. I think that's probably in the 60s, if I had to guess.
Yeah, super old.
And built this little winery here that kind of supplied the town with wine. I don't know how far. They definitely weren't selling wine all over the state. Actually, I brought a jug here. The way it worked there was you just brought a jug in like this. This is actually a Pagani bottle that we had in the tasting room.
Could you show that one more time?
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so you would just come in and he would fill you up with what you wanted. I seriously doubt they had a very big selection of wines. I would think this is actually, funnily enough, a rosé. I would never have guessed that this bottle would have said rosé on it, but it does. Oh. I would think that a lot of it would have been Chablis, or maybe some Italian varietals, or just red blends would probably have been the most popular thing at that time.
Probably, absolutely. Yeah, so they kind of were making a little bit more, kind of like a jug winery, as you said. Like they were making some larger scale stuff, but pretty fun. That they were kind of thought of as one of the first. I think they were thought of as one of the first tasting rooms in all of Sonoma, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, 1906, that's very early.
Very early.
I would think it was more of a place to pick up wine than a traditional tasting room, as people would think of it now. If you were in the area, you'd probably stop in and fill up a couple jugs and bring them home and have it for however long it lasted you.
Exactly. Yeah, and it probably lasted longer too back then.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share a photo really quick here because we're going to get into now a bit more of Kenwood's, oh, there we go, Kenwood's history here. So, you know, we made it through Prohibition, like you were mentioning before, sacramental wines and things, and it sounds to me like the Kenwood winery, the Pagani Brothers winery, made it through Prohibition making sacramental wines, and so, you know, just kind of kept on going as a winery in the way that they wanted it for a few years until we get to the 70s with the huge boom in California winemaking in Sonoma and Napa. And so can we have a little bit of a chat here about these fine men on the screen here, the Lee brothers, and their impact at Kenwood, why they decided to purchase it, and what they wanted to do with the winery?
Yeah, so they were a San Francisco family, and I think came up here as a lot of people did at that time to go to the hot springs that were in Sonoma. It was kind of like a vacation place for them. So the guy on the left, I think, is a grape grower. I'm not 100% sure who he is. To his right, his name is John Sheila. He's married to Mike Lee's and Marty Lee's sister. So he was one of the original owners that started the winery. Next to him is one of the Paganis. I think this is Julius Pagani that they actually purchased the property from. Mike Lee is to his right. He was one of the Lee brothers, obviously. His brother Marty's not in this picture. He was the winemaker here. He actually lived in the little house that's now our admin building on the property at Kenwood.
I did not know that.
Yeah, that was a home for a long time, and they've obviously renovated it. Now it's an office for a lot of our folks. And then to Mike's right, that's actually his dad, who was a really interesting person. He was a police officer in San Francisco and actually was one of the lead investigators on the Zodiac case, which was a pretty high-profile case in Northern California that really terrorized this whole region for like 10 or 15 years.
Oh, wow.
So this guy probably had some stories to tell.
So why did these guys want to buy a winery?
I think it was just a sense of adventure for them. They certainly weren't buying a winery like you would think of today. This was a rundown facility that sold jug wine to the townsfolk of Kenwood. This was not much more than that. So they saw it as an opportunity to maybe get out of the city and do something that these guys had a lot of fun doing this back in this time. I would have loved to have worked in that period of time in the wine business.
I definitely would as well. That was a fun time, you know, when you watch the movie Bottle Shock and things, and it's just like the Wild West of winemaking. What a good time.
Yeah.
So these guys got together, they purchased the winery, and they named it Kenwood, which can you explain where the name comes from?
Well, it comes from the town of Kenwood, but still to this day, I mean, if you blink, you've driven through Kenwood. It's right between Sonoma and Santa Rosa, but there's very few homes here. I mean, maybe a few thousand people live in the town of Kenwood. There's one stoplight. It's not much of a town, so I think that was just a little maybe homage to the town. I think it's a good name. You know, some people always think it's somebody's last name, but no, it's just the town of Kenwood.
Yep. No, it's great. And I think that stoplight is like the one right outside the winery there. So
yeah, that's it.
Gets people to want to turn in, right?
Yep.
So, so are the Lee brothers still involved in the winery at all, or where do we kind of see them come into play here and there?
No. In fact, I think the only person that's even alive in this photo is John Sheila to the left of Mr. Pagani here. They've all since passed away, unfortunately.
Gotcha. All right. So since they kind of built up the winery, they really wanted to kind of modernize it, and you know, they've done some influential changes to the winery. As we mentioned, the barn itself was made in 1906. So here's an image of the barn there, and the barn was made in 1906, and we actually still use it as our tasting room today. And it was originally, you know, the winery, and you can kind of see some glimpses of that when you go behind the tasting room bar and into the back there. You can kind of see that's where the operations took place. But were there any like kind of big influential things that the Lee brothers introduced to this region or to the winemaking in this area in the 70s that kind of helped to really modernize Kenwood?
Well, yeah, when they bought this really was the winery, this barn here. All the buildings that are above it were not there at all. So they really made big additions to make more wine and make a lot better wine. All of the tanks when they took over were made of either redwood or old oak. And in the 70s, stainless steel was starting to become a thing that a lot of winemakers started using to improve wine, just improve sanitation. And so they bought some stainless steel tanks that we actually still have that are probably from the 70s or 80s. Right above the tasting room actually is the original winery that they added on to, and it's got, I think, about 10 tanks in it. So that's still there. And just kind of like a lot of traditional wineries that started like Kenwood, they built onto it as the business started to grow, and they just could not make enough wine to feed the amount of wine that they could sell. So definitely made the winery way bigger and more modern, using more modern techniques of using cooling during fermentation. This is all stuff that was not even happening here until like the 60s and 70s. So they were on the forefront of really California being seen as a place that could make some really good wines and not just this jug wine that they sold out of a barn for, almost 100 years.
Right, exactly. So one of the I love talking about a little bit of this story. We don't currently make the artist series anymore, but that was kind of something that they started to do. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the artist series and the infamous labels and all of that?
Yeah, so I think their first artist series was in 1975 or really close to that year. They kind of took the idea from Chateau Mouton Rothschild. They had been doing that since maybe the 50s or 40s even. I think the Lees came up with better labels. If you look at some of those older ones that they were doing in France, didn't really have a whole lot of artwork on it. It was small, and they decided to turn that into a bigger thing. And the first one that they did had a picture of a naked lady on it, which was very tame by today's standards, but the label actually was not approved to be put out to the public because it was deemed lewd, I guess. So that was kind of a funny story. And they had actually already been bottling that wine, so some of it got bottled with that label on it, and they had to stop and change the label, which basically meant just taking the lady off the picture and it's just a picture of a hillside. It looks like nothing. But it's a great story, and I think it helped them sell that wine for sure to make it popular. And I know there's probably some people here that sell wine on the streets, but if you have a great story, it really helps to get people behind you and want to sell it. So that was a great story that they had.
It's a great story to tell, and it's got kind of this funny history to it. And we had different iterations of the label year after year after year. So a really kind of, I think a lot of people, that's their image of Kenwood, is these really cool labels. But obviously we have an incredible portfolio now. Once Pernod Ricard purchased the property in 2014, there's been some amazing changes made to it. We have all these different ranges. We have 6 ridges, which is really what we're here to talk about over the next few days. Can you talk a little bit much about the evolution of 6 ridges and how that came to be?
Yeah, I think not doing the artist series, there was a little bit of a gap left for us to make a wine that was seen as our highest quality wine, and that ended up becoming 6 ridges. And I love the fact that they've chosen what I think are the best areas in this Northern California region to make the wines that we've picked for those labels. So since 2014, there's been a ton of changes at Kenwood, not just for labels and stuff like that, but just equipment that the winery needed as well to help us make these wines that we are right now that are amazing. There was a ton of work that Pernod put in the second that they took over with our crushing, where we crush grapes, was completely changed. Actually, if you can believe it, right on Lauren's shoulder to the right there, the grape trucks that delivered used to drive down right there. And if you can imagine that happening during harvest with all the people that could be in the tasting room tasting. It was actually extremely dangerous and a very bad setup. So that was changed. So there's been a lot of improvements to help us make these amazing wines that we're making right now.
Yeah, I actually what I kind of love about Kenwood is, and maybe I'll start with Sonoma in general, is it is such kind of like this more wild and rustic region, you know, compared to a lot of people say like Napa's like the Disneyland of it's amazing region, but Sonoma's got this kind of like rustic wild character to it, and I think Kenwood really emulates that, especially, you know, when you're driving up to Kenwood, it's kind of tucked further behind, and actually a lot of wineries are kind of that way in Sonoma, and so it's less you know, it's very modest, and you drive down this beautiful lane, and all of a sudden you pull up at this old barn that's over 100 years old that's still used as our tasting room. So it's just kind of this more, to me, a little bit more of like an authentic and genuine experience. And, you know, you'll see as you're going to walk into the tasting room, you'll see the winemakers and the cellar master. I mean, you guys are just walking back and forth between it. Between the office is right next to the tasting room, and the tanks are right behind. I mean, it's all right there. And I know people say we kind of operate as a small, large winery, or a large, small winery. And it definitely is the case when you're there. And I love that kind of more authentic, genuine feel to it. And then also when you're walking around, you know, this winery, we're trying to preserve that heritage from so long ago. We've got this beautiful barn from 1906, and we've got these additions from the 70s, and we're preserving all of that without, you know, knocking it down and making something better. So you've got these pipes sticking out of the wall to do gravity flow. I just think it's a really awesome experience to see, and it's very different than a lot of other winery experiences.
Yeah, you definitely feel like you're at a winery when you're at Kenwood. There's other tasting rooms near it. I'm not saying anything bad about them, but it doesn't seem like a winery. It's just a really nice place to sit down and have a glass of wine. But yeah, you're right. You know, a lot of these doors are open when we're working, and you can see all the tanks in there. I think a lot of people really like that because it's unusual.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. So I've gotten to all the questions that I had for you to talk about, and we're kind of coming up on that 30-minute mark where we wanted to leave the last, you know, 15 minutes if we need all that time to answer any questions from the audience. And remember, like, Sean is our expert. He's been around for forever with Kenwood, so he knows a lot about Kenwood, knows a lot about Sonoma with his family heritage. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions now, and I think, Desiree, if you want to read off some of those questions, that would be really helpful.
Sure. So we have a question from Juan. He says, isn't Kenwood Vineyards one of the original Sonoma appellation wineries? What would be some of the other original Sonoma wineries? Any input on that one?
Some of the other original Sonoma wineries, Kenwood is old. If you look at a label that has the winery bond on there, Kenwood's is like 970 something. That's insanely low compared to where I think we're in like the 20,000s now. Some other Sonoma ones, obviously Buena Vista, Gunlock Bunchu, still a family winery and still a really old family winery that they started in the 1800s too. They might be one of the only family-owned Sonoma wineries left that are as big as they are. Trying to think of some other ones that are, boy, it's hard to come up with them because it is so old. I think Hansel is another really good winery. They're pretty old as well. I'm not an expert on 1970s wineries other than Kenwood.
But I mean, the you know, the winery, the Buena Vista winery, I mean, that was in mid 1800s. So, you know, only within, you know, the 50 years or so after that is when Kenwood started, which is pretty incredible. That we were that, or not Kenwood, but the Pagani brothers, the barn.
And Buena Vista didn't even make it. They were out of business for a while. A lot of the wineries that started it that long ago, it was bad timing. It didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Dang.
Thanks for that input. We have another question from Kenwood's winemaker, Zeke Neely. He asked, whatever happened to the Count Haraszthy? He's heard a couple stories.
Okay, so there's a lot of stories about Augustin Haraszthy that may or may not be true. He is Hungarian, so he's kind of got that gypsy vibe going. But the story of his demise, unfortunate demise, was that the California wine thing didn't work out for him. He wasn't making any money at it. So his next get-rich scheme was to move down to Nicaragua and make rum and become a rum runner. But they think he basically just disappeared out of thin air one day. And the story is they found some of his clothing next to like a little river down there. And the assumption was he was eaten by a crocodile.
Wait, these are incredible stories. I love that.
Whether or not it's true, it's a great story. But it's highly likely that is what happened.
Oh my goodness.
Thanks for that question, Zeke.
Thank you, Zeke.
I know, of course, Zeke's throwing out the hard ones. Go ahead.
We have a question from Jessica. She asked, have the fires of the past few years touched any of Kenwood Vineyards or our grower partners?
I'm not aware of anyone having actual fire damage from the fires. But since 17, we've actually had a pretty rough go at it every year since then. Kenwood is in a bad spot for the fires. It's very rural behind Kenwood. There's not much around it other than our vineyard and maybe a few homes that are very sparsely placed and kind of up in the hills. So we've really had a hard time making it through each harvest in 17 without having to stop for a while, whether it be a fire in the immediate area. The 17 fire came very close to Kenwood. In fact, some homes did burn that were right up above the winery. Vineyards are a great fire break. They don't really burn, so it kind of stopped when it got close to our property. But I have not heard of anyone actually having any of their property damaged that we buy grapes from. Although we've had to stop getting grapes just due to Kenwood, again, is in a bad area. We weren't able to come to Kenwood for a couple weeks every year since 2017, whether it's because of our power's been turned off, there's a fire in the area, or they've just shut this corridor down in between Sonoma and Santa Rosa.
Wow.
We have a follow-up question to that. How was the 2020 harvest? Any highlights or anything related to fires or anything there?
We were on our way to having a good harvest again, and unfortunately, right when we were about to start receiving reds, another fire came, and that it was basically the end of the year for us. Sometime in, boy, I don't even remember the dates this year. Sometimes in late September-ish, or even earlier. I don't remember the dates, but yeah, we hardly made any red wine this year.
And we'll make sure that we cover any more of those kind of very specific winemaking or viticulture questions tomorrow. Make sure that you tune in for that, because we've got our viticulture manager and our winemaker Zeke Neely on for that. So those will be some good questions.
Absolutely. So we just have a few more questions, Sean, that you may be able to touch on. In your opinion, is there one characteristic that sets Kenwood Six Ridges apart from its competition? And if so, what would that be?
I just think it's the fact that we've chosen these areas that are, in our opinion, the best for the individual varietals that we're putting on the label. A lot of other wineries still use the term reserve or something like that, where they just go, this is the best wine we can make by blending it all together. But we were really trying to showcase these certain regions in California that we feel are best showcase the varietals that we've picked. The cab up in Alexander Valley is amazing. Sauvignon Blanc from a little closer to Kenwood. All of these are really spectacular places for growing those varietals, and it's like Pinot in the Russian River is just incredible. So that's what I would say would set it apart, that we're actually picking regions, not just cherry picking our best varietals and blending them together.
Great point.
For sure. We're getting a few more questions. We do have a little more time, so if anyone else has any questions related to Sonoma history or Kenwood history, just pop them in the chat. We have a question from Jessa. When did Kenwood get involved with their partnership with Jack London?
That was pretty early. I would say the late 70s or early 80s. I'm not sure how they partnered up with them, but they became really close with the Shepherd family, which is they before Jack London was a state park, it was basically owned by a family that is from Sonoma, all descendants from Jack London, and they did grow grapes up there. So I think Mike and his brothers and Marty thought that that could be a great marketing tool to use that on their label, and they were totally right. The logo is amazing. So that partnership goes back a long time, definitely into the 80s.
I think I remember hearing too that at first, because they were growing all these grapes, and originally I think that they were planned to go to a different winery, and when it came time, 3 years later, once the vineyards were ready, they just it was like radio silence. So I think that they were trying to figure out where to put the grapes, and the Lee brothers were amazing and helped them out. And obviously they found out how incredible the grapes were. So
yeah, I think it was also mutually beneficial because those guys knew what sold. They were growing stuff like Pinot and Chardonnay up there on the hill, which is just like the absolute wrong place to be growing those. So they recommended that they plant, Cab and Merlot and Zin up there that really was more suited to be grown up there than stuff that they just decided to plant for whatever reason.
Right. You got any more questions in?
No. One last question about e-commerce and DTC, and then is our tasting room open?
The tasting room has been open on and off. With here in California, the stipulations with COVID have been probably more strict than in other areas. But I think the winery is open right now, but we're not letting people into the barn. So they have to. There's some picnic tables and stuff set up outside. The barn, as you can see, it isn't very big. It's not a good place to have a whole bunch of people in right now. So we've either done that, or when it was raining, they used the old Mike Lee's old house, the admin, what is now the admin building. There's a little veranda there, which is actually really nice.
I actually have to say I came for a tasting when I was visiting home a few months back, and it was amazing. So if you are in the area, they have amazing picnic tables outside, little charcuterie platter. We love Kenwood and charcuterie. So the outdoor tasting experience there was so fun, and it's beautiful almost all year round there. So highly recommend if you're in the area to definitely check it out and come support our wines.
Awesome. If there aren't any other questions, I think that is all.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that we were able to kind of explain a little bit about our history and get you guys excited for the next few days. We've got some incredible people coming up. We've got Zeke and Cecilia on tomorrow. Culture and viniculture. We've got our assistant winemaker Rachel and our sustainability manager Pablo on the next day to talk about Alexander Valley and sustainability. And then we've got Russian River and Sonoma Coast on Thursday. So a really awesome lineup over the next few days. I hope that today kind of enlightened you on a little bit of our history and why we've created this Six Bridges range and what it means to have wines over the years. So, Sean, thank you so much for being here to talk about your family history, Kenwood's history, Sonoma, all of that. You really are kind of that expert in the area. So thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And we will see the rest of you all tomorrow at the same time to talk about viticulture and viniculture. Cheers, everyone. Have a good rest of your Monday.